We've got in the studio right now, I want to bring in John McCafferty, and he's a former FBI agent, and he's helping us with this if we can get a shot of John. You've been keeping up with what's going on, John. Well, your thoughts on this as a former FBI agent and one who has followed this case.
It's a real victory for the government at this point. I mean, it's almost a clean sweep of all the counts against Jimmy Dimora and also Michael Gabor.
Ed Fitzgerald, the county, if I can find my notes here, the county executive said all of this was a big relief, that this was deserved. He said this has been a shadow hanging over the county for a long time. Time now, says Ed Fitzgerald, county executive in Cuyahoga County. Time to move on, he says.
It is time to move on. I think the people out there are, you know, they've been waiting for this. We want to put this behind us and move on.
I don't know if you've been listening. Obviously you've been listening to Ron Regan, and I know, Ron, are you still there with us? We'll touch bases with Ron right now. So shortly, what happens now? I mean, with Gabor and Dimora. Dimora found guilty on the overwhelming, almost a clean sweep. What happens now?
Well, I want to pick up on something that you and Ron were talking about before I came on, and that is whether or not the government is going to move to have Dimora and Gabor detained prior to their sentencing date. And the judge in this case, if presented with such a motion by the government, will have to make a determination as to whether or not there is clear and convincing evidence that Jimmy Dimora or Mr. Gabor are not a flight risk. So the presumption at this point is in favor of the government because they have been found guilty.
They have been found guilty. But he may not have any money to leave. But that there is always there's always that possibility. But is how the government looks at it.
But if the government moves for that, it's going to be a pretty high standard for Gabor and Dimora's defense counsel.
Okay, we're going to get you wired up so that you can hear right here on the anchor desk. I need to get you a little earpiece so you can hear what's going on. While we get that, let's go back out to Ron Regan. Ron, are you there?
Yeah, sure, Leon, go ahead.
Yeah, give us your thoughts on, you've just heard John McCafferty, former FBI agent, making his statements. Give us a little insight into that from your point of view.
Well, again, you know, I think that John summed that up pretty well. I think, you know, I really don't have any doubt that they're going to ask for that. You know, I know that his attorneys are going to argue that, you know, that he has no money, that he has nowhere to go. But we're going to wait and see what transpires, and that is undoubtedly what's happening right now. Now, I'm also guessing that when William Whitaker, who is Mr. Dimora's defense attorney, comes out later today, I wouldn't be surprised to hear that he something along the lines of that he's disappointed with the verdict, but they plan to appeal. I suspect, listening to some of the objections, and John can jump in here too, but listening to some of the objections throughout the trial, I think that Mr. Whitaker was laying a groundwork for, in fact, future appeals or appealable items.
Yeah. What do you think about that, John? You think that appeal has always been in the back of the defense's mind?
Certainly, in a case like this, especially a trial this long, and all the evidence that has come in, there are going to be issues that defense counsel may want to consider for appeal. That decision will not have to be made until after the sentencing. And as Ron alluded to earlier, the sentencing could be anywhere from 6 to 8 to 12 weeks. And that could involve a significant hearing in and of itself.
Sentence 8 to 12 weeks away from where we are, where we are right now. Frank Russo testified in this case. Of course, he was found guilty earlier and last year, and pleaded guilty to a whole bunch of charges and received 22 years, I think, something like that. Because he testified for the prosecution, what happens to Russo now? He was trying to cut a deal and get some time knocked off.
Well, what's interesting with Mr. Russo is he was actually sentenced, Leon, and then came in with his counsel and decided to cooperate. So he would be at some point making the government would make a motion for his sentence to be revised downward presumably, because of his cooperation. That's what's called a Rule 35 motion. And depending on what Dimora is facing, that's not necessarily out of the cards. His defense counsel may be considering whether or not it is in his interest at this point to cooperate with the government, if they would be willing to even entertain such cooperation.
Ron Regan, I know you're listening to all of this. Join us in this conversation. Ron, you're still there. Join us in this conversation. Give us your thoughts. You've covered all of this, including the Russo part of the story as well.
Well, as John said, Frank Russo entered the plea deal and was certainly hoping to lop off a big part of that 22 years, and now the government is going to have to make do on that in some fashion. It's hard to know how much Frank Russo will get cut off in terms of years in prison. But I want to follow up for a moment on some of these appealable issues. I have a feeling, based on how strongly William Whitaker argued in court, that he felt it would be very important for him to introduce Jimmy Dimora's paperwork that he files each year, where he essentially declares whatever his gifts are, gifts, dinners, meals, and those sorts of things. Because Dimora has said all along that if you check my disclosure statements, you'll see that I've listed a lot of things here from many of the people who've given me gifts, so I'm not trying to hide anything. But it was not allowed. Judge Sarah Leroy refused to allow that to be entered into evidence, and John might be able to speak to that, but it might have been because Dimora, since he didn't take the stand, couldn't speak directly to it, and it would have been hearsay.
Yeah, John, speak to that. By the way, your microphone is going to stay hot on all of this. We are keeping all microphones on. Speak to that. Speak to that, John.
Yeah, that was an interesting ruling because the way I interpreted what I had read about that was that the government was attempting to force Mr. Dimora to get on the stand to testify about these various disclosures made within that report. And what's interesting is, with respect to those reports, the government uses those reports as a basis for prosecutions for mail fraud or wire fraud offenses. So it was an interesting position that they were taking. But a ruling like that will probably be reviewed by a court of appeals under a harmless error standard, whether or not the exclusion of that testimony would have changed the result in the case.
John, did anything surprise you in all of this, this whole case? Was there anything that kind of floored you and caught you by surprise?
I think what caught me by surprise was the unpreparedness of defense counsel in the defense when they got to the defense portion of the case. That there seemed to be some confusion, a little bit of chaos in getting ready to put on a defense, and there didn't seem to be any clear theory in the defense.
I mean, the FBI and the federal government, the prosecutors, certainly hammered down this case when they made that raid at Dimora's home and at county offices. The feeling was that I had received that they were pretty certain they had him. They had him then.
Well, and they had Title III or wiretap evidence, which is the defendant's own statements can be very compelling evidence. But the other thing that interested me in this case is it appeared that the government kind of pared down their case or eliminated some of the various proofs or evidence that they wanted to put in. They probably felt it was going in very well. They were probably getting some feedback from the jury that they were getting it, they were following the case, and they wanted to speed it up.
Of course, we failed to say over the last hour, we want to bring Ron back in. And before I do that, I'm bringing Ron Regan back in. We've just got a response from the Cuyahoga County Democratic Party, of which Jimmy Dimora used to be the head of the Cuyahoga County Democratic Party as he was county commissioner. And the party says today's verdict and those that preceded it demonstrate that justice requires that the rule of law hold public officials and private individuals accountable for their wrong wrongdoing, and the party will continue to work constructively with the new executive and administration toward building a better Cuyahoga County here in Northeast Ohio. Let's bring in Ron Regan. Ron, before we wrap up here, your thoughts on all of that you have seen, all that you have heard, all that we have talked about today.
Well, to John's point, it was an overwhelming effort by the prosecution. This was a 4-year FBI investigation. It actually began in December of 2007. The case was essentially one of shock and awe when presented in the courtroom, and probably not as significant of a defense as Mr. Dimora may have liked. One last thought, Leon. This was election week. Tuesday was election day. And this comes down during a week where Jimmy Dimora essentially owned Election Day. And it's ironic that during the week of a major election that the jury has voted this time, and he'll be sent to prison for years.
I'm inclined to agree with you on that because he was the party chairman and because he was such a big name in the Democratic Party and in Cuyahoga County government here over the last many years. All of this happening on election week, John. His name was on the ballot many times, running for city council in Bedford Heights, running for mayor there, running for a Cuyahoga County commissioner, and truly, this is a story of a fall from grace, isn't it?
It sure is. You talk about a man who essentially started out as a janitor and worked his way up to being the mayor of a municipality and then to a county commissioner and the head of the Democratic Party. It's a tremendous fall from grace.
The old story is that he was working as a custodian or janitor, something in that line of work, and fell into a big vat of waste and went to City Hall in Bedford Heights to complain about that. And somebody says, well, maybe you ought to run for office. And Jimmy Dimora decided that he would run for office after he fell off that catwalk into that big vat of waste and ran for city council and began a long time period of working in this community, serving in this community until things went south on him and went south on the county. So what happens now? We've got a couple of minutes remaining. Where do we go from here? We've got 2.5 minutes remaining. Where do we go from here?
Well, assuming that the defendants are not detained, then we have a sentencing. And that's going to be very interesting because not only are they looking at the potential penalties that they face on those offenses for which they've been convicted, but the government can also come in and argue for enhancements beyond what those sentences may hold. To your point in Ron's, Jimmy was a public official. He held a position of trust. The government is probably going to be seeking an enhancement for that. There are also the forfeiture counts within the indictment, and whatever assets he has remaining or whatever proceeds he derived from the commission of these offenses, the government is going to be pursuing those also.
We've got about a minute remaining. Let's go back out to Ron Regan, who's right outside the courthouse there in Summit County. Are you still there, Ron?
Yeah, Leon, I am. I think John's right. I think the government will argue for an enhancement in terms of punishment, and I think that you'll hear language such as Jimmy Dimora was a public figure, that he was someone that the public trusted, and that he let down their trust, and that for the entire years of this investigation he has remained defiant and uncooperative, and I think that will also play into some of the language you hear during sentencing.
And so it has come down to this. Jimmy Dimora found guilty on the lion's share of charges. There were 37 counts, and he was found guilty on 36 of those 37, if my addition serves me correct. And Michael Gabor found guilty on many of those many of those counts. His co-defendant. Any final thoughts on?
Well, Leon, after the sentencing, even he's facing charges in another indictment.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see whether or not the government tries to use the allegations in that other indictment as evidence of relevant conduct for purposes of sentencing him in this case, and does not pursue.
Thank you, John. John McCafferty, former FBI agent, helping us understand all that has been taking place. By the way, we'll continue to stream this on Newsnet5.com. Go there, it'll be live. I'm Leon Bibb. Good afternoon.